in the rugged timber country of 1880s Oregon, where survival depended on strong backs and steady hands. Some folks lived lives that never made headlines. This here story belongs to one such soul, a young woman whose world existed without sound, and the weathered lumberjack who changed her path not through grand speeches, but through simple human decency. Back in those days, when a person's worth got measured by what they could produce, society often cast aside those it deemed burdens. But sometimes, unexpected kindness could transform a life completely. Here, among the sawdust and cedar smoke of timber country, we witness how real communication goes deeper than words, and how genuine caring can mend a broken spirit. This tale speaks to the lasting power of compassion in times when hope seemed scarcer than hen's teeth. 23. Clara's fingertips traced the purple bruise above her left elbow, then moved to the yellowing mark near her wrist. She pressed gently, testing the tenderness. Still sore, 2 days old, maybe 3, 24. The newest one, behind her shoulder blade, throbbed when she reached for the milk pail, fresh from yesterday's mishap when she'd moved too slowly folding Mother's washing. The morning light filtering through the cabin's grimy window revealed dust motes dancing lazy spirals in the stale air. Clara watched them, envying their freedom to drift wherever the breeze carried them. Nobody struck dust motes for moving the wrong way. She swept coffee grounds from the rough pine table with careful, measured strokes. Mother had slammed her tin cup down hard enough to scatter the precious grounds across the wood. Another waste? Another reason for anger brewing in the small cabin's close quarters. Clara arranged kindling beside the cast-iron cookstove, each piece exactly 2 finger widths apart. Order. Control. In a world where chaos erupted without warning, where spilled milk could bring swift punishment, these small rituals kept her from losing what remained of her sanity. The scent of old wood smoke and bacon grease clung to everything in the cramped cabin. Clara had grown up breathing that mixture, but lately it felt like breathing through wet wool, thick and suffocating. Through the frost-etched window glass, movement caught her eye. White columns of smoke rose beyond the ridge, thick, steady streams that meant the lumber camp was already busy with morning work. Clara pressed her nose to the cold pane, watching that distant promise of activity and purpose. What would it feel like, she wondered, to have work that mattered, to earn wages for effort instead of receiving blows for imagined failures? A sharp vibration through the warped floorboards warned her. Mother's heavy footstep approaching. Clara's shoulders tensed automatically as she turned back to her sweeping. "Girl!" The shout carried its familiar edge of perpetual irritation. "Where's my breakfast? Can't do nothing right? Can you—" Clara pointed toward the plate warming on the stove's edge, cornbread and bacon fat stretched thin. What little they could afford on Mother's meager widow's pension. "Cornbread looks dry as dust." Mother stabbed at the bread with her fork, examining it like evidence of wrongdoing. "Probably ruined the whole batch. Didn't you extra mouth to feed? And for what?" The words hit like familiar slaps. Clara had learned long ago not to flinch visibly. That only made things worse. Instead, she continued sweeping, each stroke deliberate and careful, counting silently to keep her hands steady. "Look at me when I'm speaking." Mother grabbed Clara's chin, forcing eye contact. "Worthless, just like your daddy said before he passed. That deaf girl will never amount to nothing," he said. Truer words never spoken. Clara met her mother's gaze steadily, refusing to show the hurt that twisted in her chest. Behind those hard eyes, she sometimes glimpsed something that might once have been love, but grief and hardship had burned it away. leaving only resentment for the daughter who couldn't hear, couldn't speak properly, couldn't be the son they'd needed to work the land. Mother released her chin with a sound of disgust and turned away to eat her breakfast in bitter silence. When the cabin finally fell quiet, Mother gone to tend what remained of their struggling garden, Clara escaped to her sanctuary. The woodshed behind the cabin offered blessed solitude. Here, surrounded by the honest scent of seasoned timber and dried leaves, Clara could breathe without measuring each movement for potential punishment. She lit her precious candle stub, one of 3 she'd managed to save from winter's end, and settled onto the wooden crate that served as her chair. The flame danced in the still air, casting shifting shadows on weathered walls, and creating a world of movement and mystery that belonged only to her. Something caught the light differently today. There, carved into the beam above her head, fresh letters marked the pine, M.H. 1879. Clara stood on her wooden crate, running her fingers over the carved initials. Wood shavings beneath were pale yellow, unweathered. Recent work, very recent. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Who had been in her shed, when, and why leave initials like a calling card for her to find in 18 years of living on this hard-scrabble patch of Oregon timber country? This shed had been hers alone. Mother never came here. Too much effort for too little reward. The nearest neighbors lived 2 miles east along the creek, and they rarely ventured this direction unless business demanded it. Clara examined the woodshed more carefully, her candle flame revealing details she'd never noticed. There, a boot print in the dirt near the door, larger than any shoe Mother owned. The print showed deep ridges from a working man's sole, still clear enough to read the nail pattern. And here, wood shavings scattered in a deliberate pattern, suggesting someone had stood exactly where she now stood, working by lamplight or moonlight to carve those mysterious letters into her private refuge. M.H. A man. Certainly. But what manner of man carved his initials in a stranger's woodshed without permission or explanation? And why choose this forgotten corner of the world to leave his mark? Clara's fingers traced each letter again, feeling the careful precision of the cuts. Whoever had done this possessed real skill with blade work. The letters were clean, even deliberate as a carpenter's joints. Not the hasty scratching of some drifter or vandal, but the measured marking of someone who took genuine pride in his craft. The wood smoke from the distant lumber camp suddenly seemed more significant. New workers arrived regularly as timber operations expanded across the Oregon mountains. Could one of them have wandered this far from camp? But why risk trespassing to carve initials in a girl's woodshed? The candle flame flickered in a draft she hadn't felt before. Clara turned toward the source, following the movement of air to a loose board in the shed's back wall. The board hung slightly askew, just wide enough for a man to slip through if he moved careful and knew what he was about. Her breath caught in her throat. Someone had created a hidden entrance. Recently, judging by the fresh scratches in the wood around the loosened nails and the way dirt had been disturbed near the gap. Terror and curiosity warred in her chest like fighting roosters. Every instinct screamed danger, strange men, secret entrances, mysterious messages carved in the dark. Yet something else stirred beneath the fear, something she hadn't felt in longer than memory. For the first time in months, perhaps years, something unexpected had entered her small, controlled world. Something that suggested life existed beyond the daily routine of bruises and bitter words and careful, fearful silence. Clara blew out her candle and slipped the stub into her dress pocket. Common sense demanded she tell Mother about the intruder immediately. Safety required it. But as she reached for the door latch, she hesitated with her hand frozen in midair. Mother would blame her somehow for not noticing sooner, for attracting unwanted attention simply by existing, for being the kind of burden that drew trouble like honey drew flies. And then would come the familiar punishment, swift, harsh, and utterly predictable in its painful conclusion. Clara's hand moved instinctively to the newest bruise behind her shoulder blade. 24 marks today. Tomorrow, would she be counting 25 through the shed's single window? The lumber camp smoke continued rising against the pale morning sky, steady and purposeful, somewhere beyond that ridge, in a world of honest work and earned wages. A man named M. was beginning his day with no knowledge that a deaf girl had discovered his secret message, and for reasons she couldn't explain or justify. Clara found herself hoping she'd discover who he was, and why he'd chosen her forgotten corner of the world to leave his mark where only she would find it. The mystery would have to wait. For now, she had floors to scrub and meals to prepare and Mother's unpredictable moods to navigate with the careful precision of someone walking on creek ice in spring. But tonight, when Mother slept deep and the cabin fell silent, Clara would return to this shed with her best candle and search every inch for more clues about her unexpected visitor. 24 bruises today, and one mysterious hope carved fresh in weathered wood, promising that somewhere beyond her small world, someone knew she existed. Before we continue, please leave a like and subscribe. Let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The general store's wooden floor groaned under Marcus Hayes's work boots as he counted silver coins onto Brennan's scarred counter. The familiar weight of honest wages felt solid between his calloused fingers. $5 for winter provisions. 2 more for the axe handle wrapped in oiled leather. That'll cover the tobacco and coffee beans, Brennan said, sweeping the coins into his cash box with practiced efficiency. Anything else strike your fancy? Marcus paused, his weathered hands hovering over his remaining silver. Through the store's dusty window, movement caught his attention. A woman in faded brown calico dragging a younger woman past the mercantile's front steps. The older woman's voice carried sharp and clear through the glass, cutting through the afternoon air like a blade through soft pine. Useless girl. Can't even carry a bucket proper without spilling half the water. The younger woman stumbled, her shoulder jerking under the older woman's iron grip. Dark hair escaped from beneath her worn sunbonnet, and she moved like someone long accustomed to sudden pain. Shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. Every step calculated to avoid giving offense. Marcus's jaw muscles tightened as he watched the pair navigate the rutted street. The younger woman's gaze swept the storefronts as they passed, alert and searching, but never meeting anyone's direct eye contact. She pressed close to the mercantile's window for just a heartbeat. Their eyes met through the streaked glass. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Long enough for Marcus to see something in her expression that made his chest constrict with recognition. Not fear exactly, but a careful blankness that spoke of practiced survival. He'd seen that look before in timber camps where bosses ruled with fists instead of fair wages. The moment stretched thin as telegraph wire, then snapped when the older woman yanked her daughter away from the window. That the Hartwell woman and her girl, Marcus asked, his voice deliberately casual as he gathered his purchases. Brennan followed his gaze toward the retreating figures and made a sound of disgust. Sarah Hartwell, sure enough. And that's Clara, the deaf one. Been owing money here since spring planting. Marcus slid 2 extra silver dollars across the counter without hesitation. Put that toward their account. Mighty generous of you. Hayes. Brennan raised an eyebrow, clearly calculating the transaction's significance. But there's near $15 owing total. Been building up steady since her husband died 2 winters back. What's the girl do for work around here? Nothing much to speak of. Can't hear proper. Can barely talk when she tries. Mother considers her more burden than help. If you catch my meaning? Brennan shrugged with the practiced indifference of someone who'd seen too much hardship. Hard life for womenfolk out here without menfolk to provide. Marcus hefted his leather-wrapped axe handle, feeling its solid weight against his palm. Outside, the Hartwell women had disappeared around the corner toward the settlement's ragged edge, swallowed by afternoon shadows. Where do they keep themselves? Old cabin past Morrison's place, maybe 1.5 miles west along the creek. Brennan leaned forward conspiratorially, lowering his voice to just above a whisper. What's your particular interest, if you don't mind my asking? Girl's got no prospects to speak of. If you understand my meaning? Marcus stepped toward the door without offering explanation, his boot heels echoing against the worn planking. The afternoon sun hit his face as he crossed the threshold. Warm despite autumn's approaching chill, the lumber camp could spare him for an hour. Maybe 2 if he moved efficient and kept his business brief. He had $15 left in his remaining wages. And suddenly, paying off a stranger's debt seemed like the most important task he'd undertake all week. But first, he needed to see exactly where they lived, and what manner of situation that deaf girl faced when nobody else was watching. The afternoon sun slanted long shadows across the Hartwell yard when Marcus approached their sagging cabin. Wet laundry hung from a rope stretched between 2 lodgepole pines, faded calico dresses, patched undergarments mended with careful stitches, and a man's work shirt with more holes than original fabric. The scent of lye soap hung sharp in the autumn air, mixing with wood smoke from the cabin's stone chimney. Sarah Hartwell emerged from behind the hanging sheets, wiping soap-raw hands on her stained apron. Her eyes narrowed to calculating slits when she spotted Marcus standing at the edge of her property, hat held respectful in his weathered hands. "What you want here?" Her voice carried the same sharp edge he'd heard outside Brennan's store, like a rusty saw blade cutting green wood. "Name's Marcus Hayes. Ma'am, work up at the timber camp." He kept his tone level and respectful, the way his father had taught him to address church ladies and other folks deserving courtesy. "Heard you might have need of assistance." "Don't need no charity from strangers." Sarah's chin lifted with practiced defiance, though Marcus noticed how her dress hung loose around her shoulders, suggesting meals skipped to stretch meager supplies. "We manage just fine on our own. Thank you kindly." Through the cabin's open door, Marcus caught sight of Clara kneeling beside the cook stove, scrubbing at blackened iron with desperate intensity. Her movements held the frantic quality of someone trying to erase evidence before discovery. Like a child hiding broken crockery from an angry parent. "Not offering charity, ma'am. Business proposition." Marcus shifted his weight from one boot to the other, choosing his words with the care of a man walking on creek ice. "Camp needs kitchen help. Cook's helper up and left last week, and we're managing poorly without proper assistance." Sarah's expression shifted from suspicion to calculation, the way a trader's face changed when hearing terms for a deal. "What manner of work you talking about in meal preparation for the crew, dishwashing after service, serving the men their victuals?" Marcus met her gaze steadily, reading the interest growing behind her initial resistance. "Room and board provided, naturally, plus wages, $2 each week, paid regular." Inside the cabin, Clara's scrubbing slowed to a halt. Her head turned slightly toward the open door, though she continued facing the cook stove. don't see how Clara could manage such responsibilities. Sarah crossed her arms over her thin chest. Girls got certain limitations. If you understand my meaning. Can't hear instruction. Can't speak proper when she tries. Saw her in town earlier today. Looked plenty capable to my eye. Sarah's laugh held no humor, sharp as breaking glass. Capable, that girl burns more food than she cooks proper. Can't even carry water from the well without spilling half of it on the ground. Marcus kept his expression neutral as granite, though his fingers tightened slightly around his hat brim. Mrs. Kellner runs our boarding house kitchen. She's got patience for training folks willing to learn honest work. And what's this arrangement worth to you? Sarah stepped closer, her voice dropping to business tones that suggested years of hard bargaining over necessities. Brennan mentioned you owe him near $15 at the store. Marcus watched understanding flicker across her weathered features like lamplight through a window. Camp work would clear that debt within 2 months' time, maybe less, depending on how quick she takes to the responsibilities. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced toward the cabin where Clara remained motionless beside the iron stove, clearly listening despite her supposed deafness. Room and board, you said, private quarters in the boarding house. 3 meals daily, prepared proper. Clean bedding changed regular. Marcus paused deliberately, letting his next words carry extra weight. And Mrs. Kellner don't hold with rough treatment of her workers. That last comment hung in the air between them like smoke from a damp fire. Sarah's eyes flashed with understanding and something that might have been relief mixed with wounded pride. When would she start this employment? Today, if she's agreeable to the terms. Marcus turned slightly toward the cabin door, raising his voice just enough. Miss Clara, you hear any of this conversation we're having? Clara's shoulders went rigid as fence posts. Slowly, she rose from beside the cook stove and appeared in the doorway, her dress bearing wet stains from washing and soap suds still clinging to her pale forearms. She looked from Marcus to her mother with careful neutrality, like someone accustomed to reading dangerous weather in familiar faces. Pack what matters to you, Marcus said directly to her, his voice gentle but clear. Time to go, if you're willing. Clara's lips parted slightly, breath-catching. Her gaze darted to her mother's face, reading the resignation there with the skill of long practice. Go on then, girl. Sarah waved a dismissive hand, though Marcus noticed the slight tremor in her fingers. One less mouth to feed around here. Take what you can carry, and don't expect to come crawling back when the work proves too much for you. Clara disappeared into the cabin's dim interior. Marcus heard soft sounds of careful movement, dresser drawers sliding open, fabric rustling, bare feet crossing creaking floorboards with practiced quiet. She returned carrying a flour sack bundle tied with kitchen twine. Whatever possession she'd chosen to take with her fit easily in one small hand. That all you're taking? Marcus asked. Clara nodded once, sharp and decisive as a hammer blow. How does the debt situation get settled? Sarah demanded, though her eyes remained fixed on her daughter rather than Marcus. I'll clear the account at Brennan's this week from my own wages. She works it off after through her earnings. Marcus looked between the two women, noting how neither met the other's eyes. Fair arrangement for all parties concerned. Sarah shrugged with forced indifference. Fair enough, I reckon. Girls, you're concerned now. Hayes. Clara stepped past her mother without a backward glance, her movements holding the purposeful quality of someone who'd been ready to leave for a very long time. She walked toward Marcus with steady steps, her flour sack bundle swinging gently at her side. As they reached the edge of the yard, Marcus glanced back once. Sarah had already turned away, disappearing behind the hanging laundry as if her daughter had never existed at all. You made the right choice, Marcus told Clara quietly as they walked toward the main trail. She looked up at him then, and for the first time, Marcus saw something other than careful blankness in her expression. Not gratitude exactly, but a spark of something that might grow into hope given proper tending. They walked toward the lumber camp in comfortable silence, their footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. But as they crested the first hill, Marcus noticed Clara's free hand moving to her left shoulder, pressing gently against fabric that might be hiding fresh bruises beneath. How many days, he wondered? Had she been counting and waiting for escape to become possible? And why did he suddenly feel certain that those mysterious initials carved in her woodshed, M.H., had been his own unconscious way of letting her know someone was watching over her, even when she felt most alone? Ms. Kellner's boarding house smelled of fresh pine lumber and honest lye soap, mixed with the rich aroma of beef stew simmering on the big cook stove. Clara followed the stout woman through rooms filled with simple, well-made furniture, rough-hewn tables polished smooth by daily use, ladder-back chairs with seats worn comfortable, narrow beds topped with colorful patchwork quilts that spoke of careful hands and patient evenings. Everything clean, everything in its proper place, everything suggesting order without fear. "Hang your things right there." Mrs. Kellner pointed to a wooden peg beside a white enamel wash basin. "That corner's yours now. Cot's got fresh linens this morning, and there's space underneath for personal items." Clara set her flour sack bundle on the narrow bed. The mattress gave slightly under the weight, real straw stuffing, not just rags and sawdust like the pallet she'd slept on at home. "Kitchen work starts before dawn breaks, mind you. You'll help with breakfast preparations. Serve the men their victuals. Then clean up afterward." Mrs. Kellner handed Clara a white apron, starched stiff as church linen. "Can you handle hot cookware without burning yourself silly?" Clara nodded, tying the apron strings with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing household tasks since childhood. "Well then, that's settled. Come along now. Might as well start learning while there's still daylight to see by." The boarding house kitchen stretched twice the length of her mother's entire cabin. Cast iron pots hung from steel hooks above a massive cook stove that could feed 30 hungry men without strain. Burlap sacks of flour and beans lined one whitewashed wall. Wheels of yellow cheese aged on wooden shelves, filling the air with their sharp, honest scent. Clara's palms began sweating inside her work dress sleeves. "Don't look so worried, child." Mrs. Kellner lifted a blue enamel coffee pot from the stove's warming plate. "We start simple around here. Coffee grinding first." She led Clara to a manual grinder bolted to the pinework table. The cast iron handle gleamed from constant use, worn smooth as river stones by countless hands turning it through countless mornings. "Beans go in the top here. See, turn steady, but not fast. Fast grinding heats the beans and ruins the flavor something terrible." Clara poured coffee beans into the grinder's wide mouth, their rich brown color catching the afternoon light streaming through gingham curtains. The first turn of the handle sent her hands skidding. Too much resistance? Wrong angle entirely. Beans scattered across the scarred table like spilled buckshot. Heat flooded her cheeks, familiar and shameful. At home, spilled beans meant sharp words followed by sharper consequences. Mrs. Kellner simply swept the scattered beans back into Clara's cupped palms. "Try again, dear. Lighter touch this time." Clara's second attempt produced only grinding metal sounds without any ground coffee to show for her effort. Her hands trembled against the cast iron handle. Muscle memory expecting punishment for failure. "Here now. Let me show you proper." Mrs. Kellner moved behind her without impatience. "Sometimes these old grinders got their own particular ways." Calloused palms covered Clara's hands, guiding them to the correct position on the handle. Mrs. Kellner's arms encircled her from behind as they turned the grinder together, creating steady rhythm that produced even perfect grounds. Feel that motion, even pressure, steady speed like a rocking chair? Mrs. Kellner's voice remained patient as Sunday morning. Coffee wants respect, not force. Same as most things worth doing. They ground together until Clara's hands learned the proper motion. Smooth, rhythmic turns that felt natural as breathing. When Mrs. Kellner stepped back, Clara continued alone, producing perfectly ground coffee that filled the kitchen with its dark, welcoming aroma. Much better. You're getting the hang of it now. Mrs. Kellner nodded approval. Next, we tackle biscuit dough. Clara's first batch emerged from the oven burned black on the bottom, while remaining raw as paste on top. She scraped charcoal into the slop bucket, hands shaking from remembered consequences of ruined food, waiting for anger that never came. Mrs. Kellner examined the burnt remains without comment, then demonstrated proper oven damper control with the patience of someone teaching a grandchild. Fire's got moods same as people, dear. You learn to read the signs, work with what it gives you. The second batch emerged golden brown and flaky as autumn leaves. Now that's fine work. Mrs. Kellner smiled, genuine warmth creasing her weathered face. You'll do just fine with practice and patience. As evening shadows stretched long through the kitchen windows, Marcus appeared in the doorway carrying a folded paper in his weathered hands. Wood shavings clung to his shirt from the day's timber work, and the scent of fresh pine followed him inside. He set the paper on the work table beside Clara's coffee grinder. "Supply list for tomorrow's order," he said, his voice gentle but clear. "Thought you might want to practice your reading skills." Clara picked up the paper, studying the carefully printed words. Some looked familiar from her old McGuffey reader. Flour, beans, coffee. Others remained mysteries written in Marcus's neat hand. Marcus pointed to one line with a calloused finger. "That says salt pork. And this one here reads molasses." Clara traced each letter with her fingertip, lips moving silently as she sounded out the syllables in her mind. The paper felt smooth and clean, official as a document from town. "You read some already, I can tell." Marcus pulled out a three-legged stool, settling beside the work table with the comfortable ease of someone accustomed to evening conversations. "Where'd you learn your letters?" Clara pointed toward her flour sack bundle, then mimed opening a book with careful hands. "Got a reader with you?" Marcus asked. Clara nodded, retrieving her battered McGuffey reader from the bundle. The book's binding had cracked from years of careful use, pages soft with handling and hope. Marcus examined the worn volume with respect, turning pages gentle as handling church hymnals. "This here's good learning material. We could work on new words during evenings, if you're willing to take instruction." Heat spread through Clara's chest, not embarrassment this time, but something warmer and unfamiliar. When was the last time someone had offered to teach her anything besides how to avoid making Mother angry? Mrs. Kellner returned carrying a steaming cup of coffee and 2 silver dimes wrapped in brown paper, the coins catching lamplight like small promises. "First day's wages," she announced, placing the wrapped coins in Clara's open palm. "You earned these fair and square through honest work." Clara stared at the silver in her hand, feeling their substantial weight. Real money, earned through effort and skill, not charity or grudging obligation. Marcus pointed to the supply list again. "Tomorrow you'll help me check inventory against this list. See which words you recognize on your own." Clara carefully folded the paper, tucking it inside her McGuffey reader along with her 2 precious dimes, the first wages she'd ever earned in her 19 years of living. As full darkness settled outside the kitchen windows, she realized something had changed in the space between her ribs. The constant tension that lived there, the waiting for harsh words or sudden punishment, had loosened just slightly, like a knot beginning to give way under patient fingers. But as she prepared for her first night in the boarding house, Clara's hand unconsciously moved to the fresh bruise behind her shoulder blade, pressing gently through the fabric of her work dress. Tomorrow morning, would she count 25 marks on her body? Or would this strange new world of patient teachers and earned wages allow her skin to begin healing from old hurts? And why did the thought of disappointing Marcus make her stomach clench with a kind of fear she'd never felt before? Not fear of punishment, but fear of losing something precious before she'd fully understood its value. Thompson tipped his felt hat when Clara served his morning coffee, the gesture stopping her cold beside his table. The simple courtesy hit her like unexpected rain after drought. Men didn't acknowledge her existence, let alone show respect. "Much obliged, miss," he mumbled into his thick gray beard, his voice rough from years of calling timber commands across noisy sawmills. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she moved to the next table, coffee pot steady despite the flutter in her chest. Logan and Peters nodded their appreciation when she refilled their tin cups. No grabbing at her skirts, no crude remarks whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Just working men accepting service with basic human decency. The rich aroma of bacon fat sizzling in cast iron skillets filled the boarding house kitchen, mixing with the honest scent of men who worked hard for their daily bread. Steam rose from plates of flapjacks and fried eggs as Clara navigated between tables, learning the rhythm of breakfast service. By the third week, the morning routine had settled into comfortable pattern. Clara arrived in the kitchen before dawn's first light. Ground coffee while Mrs. Kellner prepared biscuit dough, then served the loggers their breakfast without incident or harsh word. But communication remained a puzzle with missing pieces scattered across a table. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway as Clara finished washing breakfast dishes, her hands red from hot soapy water. He carried a piece of charcoal and pointed toward the back door with deliberate motion. "Need to show you something outside," he said, then caught himself. His weathered hands moved in careful gestures, pointing to himself, then to her, then toward the door that led to the boarding house yard. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and followed him into the morning sunlight behind the kitchen. Dew still clung to grass blades, and the air carried the clean scent of pine needles and honest earth. Marcus knelt beside the well pump, using his charcoal to sketch simple shapes in the dirt patch beside the stone foundation. First, he drew a house with smoke rising from its chimney, then a bucket with a curved handle. He pointed to the pump mechanism, then back to his rough drawing. "Pump," he said clearly, letting Clara watch his lips form the word with exaggerated care. She repeated the mouth shape, feeling air move across her tongue. "Pump." Marcus nodded encouragement, then drew a hammer striking a nail into a board. He pointed toward the tool shed where implements hung on wooden pegs, their metal heads catching early sunlight. "Hammer," Clara repeated, studying the movement of his lips and the shape his mouth made around the sounds. For the next hour, Marcus sketched objects in the dirt, while Clara practiced forming words with her mouth, feeling vibrations in her throat that corresponded to the lip movements she observed. When she pointed to a broken board hanging loose from the well's wooden cover, then mimicked hammering motions with precise movements, Marcus understood immediately without need for further explanation. He retrieved a claw hammer from the tool shed, showing Clara how to grip the wooden handle properly, then guided her hands through the motion of driving nails true and straight. Her first attempt sent the iron nail sideways into soft pine. The fourth strike hit perfect, sinking the nail head flush with the board's weathered surface. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen transform his usually serious face. "Fine work," he said, and Clara read the approval in his expression even before her mind processed the words. That evening, Marcus returned to the kitchen carrying his supply notebook and a piece of slate board. He set them on the pine work table beside Clara's coffee grinder, the slate's dark surface reflecting lamplight like still water. "Writing practice time," he announced. Pulling up his three-legged stool, Clara opened her McGuffey reader, showing him the words she'd been studying during quiet afternoon moments. Pencil marks filled the margins, her attempts to sound out unfamiliar terms using the phonetic methods the book taught. "Try copying this." Marcus wrote "fine work" on the slate in clear block letters, each character formed with carpenter's precision. Clara took the chalk piece, concentrating on making each letter match his example exactly. Her fingers, accustomed to delicate tasks like mending and food preparation, guided the chalk with steady control. When she finished, Marcus wrote "Clara, fine work," and handed the slate back to her, waiting for her response. Heat spread through her chest again, warm as kitchen fire on cold mornings. Her name, written by someone else's hand, connected to words of praise instead of criticism or disappointment. Marcus pointed to the slate, then to her, raising his eyebrows in silent question. Clara understood the invitation. She took the chalk and wrote carefully beneath his words, "Thank you, Marcus." Something shifted in Marcus's weathered expression when he read her response. He studied her face for a long moment, as if seeing something there he hadn't noticed before. Then wrote on the slate, "You stay here permanent." Clara's breath caught in her throat like a fishhook. Stay permanently, not just until Mother's debts were cleared, but as a real worker with genuine value to the boarding house community. She drew pictures beneath his question. A small house with smoke rising from its chimney, herself standing in the doorway, with books cradled in her arms. Then she sketched herself serving coffee to the loggers, Marcus teaching her carpentry skills, Mrs. Kellner demonstrating cooking techniques with patient hands. Marcus examined her drawings with the careful attention he'd give to building plans, studying each detail. When he looked up again, his weathered face held something she couldn't quite identify. Not pity or charity, but something deeper and more solid than either. He wrote on the slate, "Family." Clara stared at the word written in Marcus's neat hand. Family. Not obligation or charity or temporary work arrangement. Family chosen rather than inherited, built on mutual respect instead of blood ties or legal claims. She picked up the chalk, her hand steady now with newfound certainty, and wrote beneath his word, "Yes." Marcus extended his calloused palm across the work table. Clara understood the gesture and placed her hand in his, feeling the roughness of honest labor against her own work-hardened skin. They shook once, formally, sealing an agreement that had nothing to do with wages or debt payments. As autumn deepened toward winter's approach, Clara's confidence grew alongside her practical skills. She could prepare fluffy biscuits without burning them black, serve coffee without spilling precious drops, and recognize most words on Marcus's carefully written supply lists. The loggers had accepted her presence as natural part of their daily routine, no more remarkable than sunrise or the evening meal bell. But late one evening, as Clara practiced writing letter formations by lamplight in the boarding house parlor, Mrs. Kellner appeared beside her chair with unusual urgency written across her normally calm features. "Clara, dear," Mrs. Kellner said quietly, her voice carrying worry like storm clouds gathering. "There's someone here asking to see you." Clara looked up from her slate to find her mother standing in the parlor doorway, travel-stained and carrying a carpet bag with a broken leather handle. Sarah Hartwell's face bore the hard expression Clara remembered too well, mixed with something that might have been desperation. "Time to come home, girl," Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the parlor's peaceful atmosphere like an axe through green wood. "I got need of you back where you belong." Clara's chalk slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering onto the wooden floor like a gunshot in church. After 2 months of safety and growing confidence, after learning to write her own name and earn honest wages, why had her mother appeared now like a ghost from an unwanted past? And what would happen to her carefully built new life if she was forced to return to that cramped cabin with its familiar cycle of punishment and fear? Through the parlor window, Clara could see lamplight burning golden in Marcus's quarters across the yard. But would even his protection prove strong enough against a mother's legal claim to reclaim her daughter? Marcus kept a small daguerreotype wrapped in oiled cloth, tucked beneath his extra woolen shirt, in the pine crate beside his narrow cot. Clara had never seen him examine it, but she'd noticed his careful handling when rearranging his few possessions, the way his weathered fingers lingered on the small bundle before placing it reverently back in its hiding place. Tonight, as winter wind rattled the boarding house windows like skeletal fingers, Marcus sat across from her at the kitchen table. Their slate lay between them, covered with her evening writing practice, letters growing more confident each day, words forming with increasing clarity. But instead of adding new vocabulary to her lessons, Marcus withdrew the mysterious bundle from his flannel shirt pocket. His calloused hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped the oiled cloth, revealing what lay protected inside. The lamplight caught the daguerreotype's silver surface, bringing the captured image to life in the flickering glow. The photograph showed a woman in a wedding dress, her hair arranged in careful ringlets beneath delicate lace veil. She gazed directly at the camera with serious dark eyes and the faintest suggestion of a smile playing at her lips, as if sharing a private joke with the photographer. Marcus touched the image gently with his forefinger, then looked at Clara with an expression she'd never seen before, vulnerability mixed with something that might have been peace. "Mary," he said, pointing to the woman preserved in silver and light. Clara leaned forward, studying the delicate features caught forever in their wedding day moment. The woman appeared young, perhaps 25, with kind eyes that reminded Clara somehow of Mrs. Kellner's patient expression when teaching kitchen skills to fumbling hands. The wedding dress was beautiful beyond anything Clara had ever seen, real silk by the look of it, with tiny pearl buttons marching up to her throat and sleeves that ended in delicate points over small hands folded in her lap. Marcus touched his chest with his free hand, then shook his head slowly, the motion heavy with old grief. Clara understood immediately. His wife had died. She picked up the chalk, drew a simple cross marking a grave on the slate, then looked at Marcus with raised eyebrows. A question written in gesture and symbol. Marcus nodded, his jaw working silently for a moment before words came. "Typhoid fever took her. 3 years back now." Each word seemed to cost him effort, like lifting heavy timber. "We had plans, you understand? House in town with a real parlor, maybe children running around the yard." Clara traced the daguerreotype's silver edges with her fingertip, noting how the metal had worn smooth from Marcus's handling. This image had been touched often, studied in quiet moments when grief needed gentle company. Marcus watched Clara examine the photograph, then pointed to her worn McGuffey reader where it lay beside the slate. "Mary taught school before we married," he said, his voice gaining strength. 23 young ones in her classroom, and she knew every one of their names, their troubles, their particular gifts. His weathered face softened with memory. "She'd have taken pure joy in helping you with reading lessons." Clara picked up her chalk and drew carefully on the slate, a schoolhouse with children gathered around, then herself holding books, then a question mark floating above the scene. Marcus examined her drawings, understanding her meaning without need for explanation. "You thinking about teaching someday?" he asked. Clara nodded enthusiastically, then drew more pictures, herself reading to children gathered on wooden benches, pointing to letters chalked on a blackboard, helping young students form words on their own slates with patient guidance. "Fine dream," Marcus said, genuine approval warming his voice. Mary always maintained that teaching was the finest work anybody could do in this world. "Lighting candles in young minds," she used to say. Clara drew a small cabin next, with smoke rising straight from its stone chimney and a garden beside the front door filled with vegetables and flowers. She pointed to herself, then to Marcus, then to the cabin she'd sketched. "You wanting to stay here permanent-like?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. Clara wrote on the slate in her increasingly confident letters, "Family." Marcus studied her face for a long moment in the golden lamplight. Something passed between them across the table, not romance or attachment between man and woman, but deeper recognition. Two people who'd lost their original families and found each other in the aftermath of loss, building something new from shared understanding. "I'd be honored to have you consider me family," Marcus said quietly. He rewrapped Mary's daguerreotype in its protective cloth, then pulled out his supply notebook. On a fresh page, he wrote slowly and deliberately, "Clara Hayes, adopted daughter, December 1880. Clara's breath caught when she saw her name written with his surname attached. Hayes, not Hartwell anymore, with its memories of fear and daily punishment, but Hayes, a name chosen rather than inherited, earned through mutual respect rather than accident of birth. She took the pencil from Marcus's work-hardened hand and added beneath his careful notation, "Marcus Hayes, chosen father." They sat in comfortable silence as the lamp flame danced between them, casting their shadows large and peaceful on the kitchen walls. Outside, winter wind continued its restless song through the pine forest. But inside, warmth settled around them like a shared quilt on cold nights. Marcus pointed to her writing practice scattered across the slate. "Tomorrow evening, we'll work on longer sentences. Maybe start composing letters to folks in town." Clara nodded eagerly, already imagining the possibilities. Letters to the minister about starting reading lessons for children who needed learning. Notes to Brennan at the general store about special supply orders. Real communication with the wider world beyond the boarding house walls. As they prepared to end their evening lesson, Marcus gathered the slate and chalk while Clara closed her McGuffey reader, marking her place with a strip of cloth torn from an old apron. "Clara," Marcus said, his voice carrying unusual gravity. She looked up, noting the tension that had crept into his shoulders, the way his hands had stilled over the learning materials. "Your mother came by the sawmill today," he said quietly, each word deliberate as hammer blows. "Asked particular questions about you? About the work arrangement we made?" Clara's spine went rigid as fence wire. Her hands moved instinctively to her ribs, where old bruises had finally faded to nothing under Mrs. Kellner's steady feeding and Marcus's patient protection. "Seems she's facing financial troubles again," Marcus continued, choosing his words with the care of someone navigating dangerous ground. "Looking for ways to—" He paused, searching for gentle phrasing. "To reclaim what she considers rightfully hers." The lamp flame flickered as if responding to Clara's sharp intake of breath. She grabbed the chalk, wrote quickly on the slate with letters growing larger and more urgent. "Stay here, not go back." Marcus nodded firmly, his weathered face set with determination. "That's exactly what I told her, in words she couldn't misunderstand. But she mentioned legal rights, mother's authority over unmarried daughters under 21 years. Clara stared at the slate, her mind racing like runaway horses. After months of safety and learning and belonging somewhere, after discovering she had value beyond being a burden, was it all about to disappear because of laws written by men who'd never lived with daily fear? Marcus reached across the table, covering her trembling hand with his steady palm. "We'll figure something out," he said with quiet conviction. "You're not going back to that life, Clara. I give you my word on that." But as Clara looked into Marcus's determined face, one terrifying question burned in her mind like acid. What if a promise wasn't enough to protect her from a mother's legal claim? And what if Sarah Hartwell arrived tomorrow morning with Sheriff Morrison in tow, demanding her property be returned to where it legally belonged? The lamp flame wavered between them, and Clara realized that sometimes even the warmest light could be snuffed out by winds too strong to resist. Sarah Hartwell arrived 3 days later during the breakfast rush, when Clara couldn't escape to her room or slip away to the woodshed behind the kitchen. She stood in the boarding house doorway, wearing her travel-stained brown dress and an expression of calculated desperation that Clara recognized like her own reflection. "There's my girl," Sarah announced loud enough for every logger in the dining room to hear clearly. "Come to take you home where you belong proper." Clara's hands froze around the blue enamel coffee pot she'd been carrying to Thompson's table. Hot liquid sloshed against the metal sides, scalding her fingertips through the thin handle. She set the pot down carefully on the scarred pine table, not trusting her suddenly nerveless grip. The rich smell of bacon grease and flapjacks turned sour in her nostrils. "Ma'am?" Mrs. Kellner stepped forward from behind the serving counter, arms crossed over her aproned chest like a fort wall. "This here's a working kitchen during meal service. You'll need to conduct your business elsewhere." "My business is with my daughter." Sarah's voice carried the sharp edge Clara remembered cutting through her childhood like a rusty blade. "Legal business that don't concern hired help or interfering strangers." Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his work clothes from early morning timber cutting. Sawdust clung to his flannel shirt and caught in his dark beard. His weathered face remained neutral as granite. But Clara noticed the tension gathering in his shoulders like storm clouds. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said evenly, his voice carrying no welcome. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Bet you didn't." Sarah's laugh held no humor, sharp as glass breaking on stone. "Got word from folks in town that my Clara's been playing house here instead of earning proper wages to support her kin. High time she came back where she's needed." "Girls working honest employment here," Mrs. Kellner interrupted, her voice rising with indignation. "Earning her keep same as anybody else in this establishment. Employment that rightfully belongs to me." Sarah stepped further into the kitchen, forcing the loggers to look up from their breakfast plates with uncomfortable expressions. "That girl owes me for 18 years of food and shelter and maternal care. High time she started paying back what she owes." Clara felt heat climb her neck like rising water as every pair of eyes in the room focused on her with sudden interest. These men who'd treated her with growing respect over the past months, what did they think now? That she was disputed property being fought over, a burden passed between adults who considered her incapable of making choices. Her stomach twisted with shame, thick as creek mud. "Debt's already settled fair and square," Marcus said quietly, his words careful as footsteps on thin ice. "Paid Brennan your full account months back from my own wages. Store debt, maybe so." Sarah's smile turned calculating as a card sharp's. "But there's other considerations you ain't thought of. Feed bills going back years, doctor visits when she was small and sickly, clothes and shoes and everything else it takes to raise a child proper." She gestured at Clara's clean apron and sturdy work dress. 18 years of expenses that need settling before she goes anywhere?" Clara's stomach dropped like a stone down a well. She looked down at her hands gripping the edge of Thompson's table, these hands that had learned to grind coffee perfectly, to serve meals without spilling a drop, to write her own name in clear letters on slate board. "How much money you talking about?" Marcus asked, though Clara heard reluctance in every word. $50 cash money, plus her future earnings until she marries proper and becomes some other man's responsibility. The sum hit the kitchen like a physical blow, silence spreading outward from Sarah's words. $50 represented months of wages for anyone in the room, more money than most folks saw in half a year of honest labor. Clara's throat constricted as she calculated desperately. At her current earnings, it would take nearly a year to repay such an impossible amount. A year of servitude while everyone knew she was working off debt like some kind of indentured servant. That's highway robbery, plain and simple, Mrs. Kellner snapped, her cheeks flushing red with anger. That's motherhood and Christian duty, Sarah replied coolly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd studied legal matters. Law supports a parent's right to compensation for raising children to working age. Sheriff Morrison confirmed it himself just yesterday. Clara watched Marcus's jaw tighten as he considered Sarah's demand, his weathered hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. $50. Money he didn't have. Couldn't borrow from anyone. Couldn't earn quickly enough to matter. The scent of cooling food and coffee turned bitter in the suddenly tense air. "Give me 1 week," Marcus said finally, defeat creeping into his voice like water through cracked wood. "I'll find the money somehow. Weeks too long for my circumstances." Sarah shook her head with false regret. "Girl comes with me right now, or I go straight to Sheriff Morrison about theft of family property and illegal harboring of a minor child." The word property struck Clara like a slap across the face. She raised her eyes to look around the kitchen. At Thompson carefully studying his coffee cup. At Peters shifting uncomfortably in his wooden chair. At Logan examining his plate like it held secrets. Property. That's what they'd heard her called. Not a person who'd earned her place through honest work and learning, but disputed property causing legal trouble between adults who mattered. Shame burned through Clara's chest, hot and acidic as lye soap. The respect she'd thought she'd earned, the belonging she'd felt growing day by day, all of it crumbling like wet paper in rain. She untied her white apron with shaking fingers, folded it with the careful precision Mrs. Kellner had taught her, and held it out toward her mother like a flag of surrender. Marcus stepped forward urgently. "Clara, no. We'll figure out something else. Don't let her—" But Clara was already walking toward the wooden peg where her flour sack bundle waited. The same pathetic collection of possessions she'd arrived with months ago. She'd thought she belonged here. Thought she'd earned her place through competence and character. Instead, she'd brought nothing but conflict and debt and legal complications to people who'd shown her nothing but kindness. Sarah smiled with triumph that made Clara's stomach turn. Smart girl? Knows where her loyalty belongs and her legal obligations lie. Clara paused beside Marcus on her way to the door, pulling her small cloth pouch of saved wages from her dress pocket. 12 silver dimes earned over 2 months of careful work and growing confidence. She pressed the coins into his calloused palm, her touch lingering for just a moment. "For the trouble I caused," she mouthed silently. Knowing he could read her lips by now, Marcus's weathered face went pale as old bone. "Keep your wages, Clara. You earned them fair and square through honest work." But Clara was already walking toward the door where Sarah waited with barely concealed impatience. Her mother's hand clamped onto her arm the instant she stepped outside. Familiar grip, familiar pressure that would leave familiar finger marks by evening. As they reached the edge of the boarding house yard, Clara looked back once through the morning mist. Marcus stood in the kitchen doorway watching them leave, her silver dimes still clutched tight in his fist like he was holding on to something precious. "Don't look so mournful, girl," Sarah said, jerking Clara forward toward the borrowed wagon. You'll thank me someday for saving you from that foolish nonsense." They walked toward the wagon in heavy silence, Clara's boots squelching in morning mud that seemed to pull at her feet like quicksand. But as she climbed onto the hard wooden seat, a terrible realization struck her like lightning. Marcus had never asked her about those carved initials in her old woodshed. M.H. Marcus Hayes? Which could only mean he'd been the one who carved them, watching over her situation long before their supposed first meeting at Brennan's store. How many nights had he checked on her through that loose board? And what would happen to his protective surveillance, now that Sarah had legal authority to take her anywhere she chose, far from anyone who might interfere with a mother's rightful discipline of her wayward daughter? The borrowed wagon lurched over frozen ruts as Sarah drove them back toward the old cabin, each jolt sending Clara's teeth chattering and her shoulder aching where her mother's fingers had dug in like iron nails during their departure from the boarding house. "Should have seen their faces when I laid down the law," Sarah muttered, guiding the tired horse around a fallen branch that blocked half the muddy track. "High and mighty timber folk thinking they could steal my property without facing consequences." Clara gripped the wooden seat with both hands, her flour sack bundle pressed tight against her ribs like armor that wouldn't protect her from what was coming. Each familiar landmark they passed: the stand of dead pines where she used to gather kindling, the creek crossing where the bridge had washed out last spring, felt smaller somehow, meaner and more cramped than memory suggested. The scent of wood smoke from distant cabins mixed with the horse's sweat and the sour smell of her mother's unwashed travel clothes. $50, Sarah continued with satisfaction thick as molasses. "More money than this family's seen since your daddy passed. That Hayes fellow will pay up eventual. Mark my words, sure as sunrise. Guilty conscience makes men generous with their coin." The wagon wheel hit a deep rut, filled with ice-crusted water. Throwing Clara sideways against her mother's bony shoulder, Sarah shoved her away with unnecessary force. "Sit straight, girl. Don't need you falling out and breaking something that might prove useful later." As they approached the sagging cabin, Clara noticed changes that hadn't been visible from a distance during her hasty departure months ago. The roof had lost more cedar shingles. Several patches of bare wood showed where winter storms had stripped away protection from rain and snow. One corner of the front porch had sagged even lower, creating a dangerous gap in the weathered floorboards. The whole structure looked like it was slowly surrendering to the Oregon weather. Sarah pulled the horse to a stop beside the cabin's front door, the leather traces creaking in the cold air. "Home again," she announced with bitter triumph. "Back where you belong by law and Christian duty." Clara climbed down from the wagon seat, her legs stiff from the cold ride and her heart heavy as wet wool. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, revealing the dim interior she remembered too well. The same cramped rooms, the same smell of damp wood and old cooking grease, and something else she couldn't name but recognized as hopelessness. But as she stepped across the familiar threshold, Clara realized something fundamental had shifted inside her during those months at the boarding house. The cabin walls that once defined her entire world now felt like a trap closing around her shoulders, making it hard to draw full breath. The air inside tasted stale and sour. "Put your belongings in the corner where they belong," Sarah commanded, settling into her chair beside the scarred table with a grunt of effort. "Then get that fire started proper. Place is cold as a tomb, and I'm chilled through to the bone." Clara set her flour sack bundle beside the door and knelt before the cast-iron cookstove, opening the firebox to reveal nothing but cold ash and a few charred stick ends. She arranged kindling with the careful precision Marcus had taught her, building a foundation that would catch quickly and burn clean without wasting precious fuel. Her hands moved with new confidence, no trembling or desperate haste born from fear of failure. Just steady, competent work, learned through patient instruction rather than harsh punishment. As the first flames took hold and began dancing in the firebox, Clara noticed something that made her pause in her work. Her mother was watching her with eyes that held something besides the usual criticism and disappointment. "About time you learned something useful," Sarah said with sharpness, but her voice lacked its typical sharp edge. "Though I expect that boarding house filled your head with all manner of foolish notions." Clara added larger pieces of seasoned oak to the growing fire, adjusting the damper to control the draft exactly as Mrs. Kellner had shown her. The flames steadied into reliable heat that began warming the cabin's close air. "Don't think this arrangement's going to last forever," Sarah continued, though she pulled her shawl closer around her thin shoulders. "Soon as Hayes pays what he rightfully owes, you'll be earning proper wages instead of playing at independence like some kind of fine lady." Clara straightened from the cook stove, wiping ash from her hands on her work dress. Sarah was studying her with calculating eyes, as if seeing her clearly for the first time in years instead of looking through her like she was part of the furniture. "You look different somehow," Sarah said slowly, her voice holding puzzlement. "Healthier, fuller in the face, and stronger in the shoulders." Clara touched her cheek unconsciously. Mrs. Kellner's regular meals had indeed added weight that softened the sharp angles of chronic hunger, and daily kitchen work had built muscle in her arms and back. Her hair, washed weekly with real soap instead of harsh lye, caught the firelight with unfamiliar shine. Soft living, Sarah concluded with disapproval, though Clara noticed her mother's own dress hung loose around her shoulders. "Won't last long in this house, I can promise you that." As evening settled over the cabin like a moth-eaten blanket, Clara prepared their meager supper, cornbread made with the last of their flour and beans stretched thin with water to make them last until the next trip to town. She worked silently, but her mind remained active as the flames she tended. $50. The sum represented impossible wealth for a family that counted pennies for flour and saved bacon grease like liquid gold. Even if Marcus could somehow borrow such an amount, paying it back would take years of timber wages, years during which she'd remain bound to this cabin and her mother's increasingly unpredictable moods. But as Clara set their simple meal on the table, she noticed something that made her hands still over the chipped plates. Sarah's fingers shook as she lifted her coffee cup, not with anger or cold, but with weakness that seemed to come from deep inside her bones. Her cheekbones stood out sharper than Clara remembered, and when she thought her daughter wasn't watching, Sarah's face sagged with exhaustion that spoke of more than just a difficult day's travel. "Eat up, pay up, girl," Sarah commanded. But Clara watched her mother push food around her plate without taking substantial bites, as if the effort of chewing had become too much trouble. After Sarah retired to her bed in the cabin's single back room, Clara remained by the dying fire with her McGuffey reader open on her lap. She pulled her slate pencil from the book's pages and used its sharp point to carve careful letters into the wooden table's scarred surface. Clara Hayes, 1880. Not Hartwell, Hayes. The name she'd chosen for herself, regardless of legal documents or maternal claims or the opinions of folks who thought they knew where she belonged. As she worked by firelight, a sound from outside made her hands go still and her heart jump like a startled rabbit. Footsteps in the yard, careful and deliberate. Someone moving with practiced stealth toward the cabin through the darkness. Clara set down her pencil, pulse hammering against her throat like a trapped bird. Through the grimy window, she glimpsed a familiar silhouette approaching through the shadows between the pine trees. Marcus. But why was he moving so carefully, like a man trying not to wake sleeping children? And why had he come alone in the middle of the night when discovery could bring serious consequences as his shadow reached the cabin's front wall? Clara realized the footsteps weren't stopping at the door. They were circling the building, as if Marcus was searching for something specific, or someone who might need finding. What had he discovered that brought him here under cover of darkness, risking Sarah's anger and possible legal trouble? And what would happen if her mother woke to find him prowling around their property like some kind of midnight thief? Clara slipped outside through the cabin's back door, her bare feet silent on the frost-hardened ground that crunched like broken glass beneath her weight. The night air bit at her face and hands, carrying the clean scent of pine needles and wood smoke from distant chimneys. Marcus stood beside her old woodshed, examining the loose boards she'd discovered so many months ago. His breath formed small white clouds in the moonlight, and his weathered hands moved carefully along the weathered pine planking. He looked up when she appeared from the cabin's shadow, his face grave as a preacher's in the pale light. "Figured you might come out here," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Saw the lamp go out in the front window." Clara pointed to the shed, then to him, raising her eyebrows in silent question that he could read easily after their months of communication practice. Marcus nodded toward the carved initials, M.H., that had started everything between them. "Been checking on you since last winter. Every few weeks when I could manage it without being seen." He touched the letters with his fingertip. "Needed to know you were safe, that things weren't getting worse than they already were." Clara's chest tightened with understanding. All those months when she'd felt completely alone in the world, Marcus had been watching from the shadows, caring enough to risk trespassing on Hartwell property and possible legal consequences. The scent of his honest work, sawdust and pine sap, mixed with the cold night air. "Your mother's dying, Clara," Marcus continued, his words hitting the silence like stones dropped in still water. "Saw it plain as daylight in the boarding house kitchen. That's the real reason she came for you, not for $50 or legal rights." Clara shaped a question with her hands, pointing to Sarah, then making a gesture of weakness and sickness. "Consumption would be my guess, or something close to it." Marcus leaned against the shed wall, his voice heavy with certainty. "She's got maybe months left, probably less. She knows it too, which is why she invented that story about debts and legal obligations." The words hit Clara like cold creek water. Her mother's shaking hands at supper, the untouched food, the way her clothes hung loose around her shrinking frame, signs she'd noticed but hadn't understood their terrible meaning. "She needs you to take care of her through what's coming," Marcus said gently, too proud to ask direct. "So she made up reasons that would force your hand." Clara sank onto her old wooden crate, the same seat where she'd spent countless hours reading by candlelight and dreaming of escape. Her mother was dying. The woman who'd raised her with harsh words and quick punishment was facing her final months completely alone. Marcus knelt beside Clara's seat, bringing his weathered face level with hers in the moonlight. "What do you want to do about it?" he asked. Clara picked up a sharp stick and scratched words in the frozen dirt. "Stay with her. Even after everything she put you through." Clara nodded firmly, then wrote beneath her first words, "She is still my mother." Marcus smiled, the same gentle expression he'd worn when she'd successfully driven her first nail straight and true. "Mary would have admired you greatly," he said, his voice warm despite the cold air. "She always maintained that the strongest folks were the ones who chose kindness when they had every earthly reason not to." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their breath form small clouds that disappeared quickly in the winter air. Around them, the Oregon forest creaked and whispered with night sounds, owls calling, branches rubbing together, the distant sound of creek water running over stones. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "I'll bring supplies regular. Food, medicine, whatever she needs to be comfortable. You can care for her here proper. And when..." He paused, choosing words carefully. When it's finished, you'll always have a place waiting at the boarding house. Clara wrote in the dirt again, "Will you visit?" Every day I can manage, Marcus promised without hesitation. Bring you reading materials. Help with any repairs this old cabin needs to keep you both warm and dry. Clara stood and walked to the shed wall where his initials were carved deep in the weathered pine. Using her fingernail, she carefully added new letters beneath the original marking, C.H. 1880. Clara Hayes. Not property or burden to be passed between adults, but a person who'd chosen her own family while honoring the one she'd been born to. Marcus examined her addition to the carved wood, running his finger over the fresh letters. Fine choice, he said with approval. Over the following weeks and months, Marcus kept his word faithfully. He appeared daily with supplies, fresh bread wrapped in clean cloth from Mrs. Kellner's kitchen, medicine bottles from the town doctor, coal for the stove when Clara's supply ran dangerously low. He never stayed long during Sarah's waking hours, but each evening he returned to help Clara with reading lessons by lamplight and repair work that kept the aging cabin livable. Sarah's condition worsened gradually like water wearing away stone. Some days she managed to sit at the table for meals, her thin hands wrapped around a warm cup. Others, she remained in bed while Clara brought food to her bedside and helped her sip broth made from bones Marcus brought from the boarding house kitchen. But as her physical strength faded like autumn leaves, something else emerged from beneath years of hardness and disappointment. "You're a good daughter," Sarah said one morning as Clara helped her drink warm milk sweetened with precious honey. "Don't reckon I ever told you that proper in all these years." Clara smoothed the patchwork quilt around her mother's shoulders, her touch gentle, despite the memory of harsh treatment that still lived in her bones. "Should have been kinder to you," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fear makes people cruel sometimes when they don't mean to be. I was afraid every single day. Afraid we'd starve. Afraid I'd lose you too after losing your daddy." Clara took her mother's thin hand in both of hers, feeling how fragile the bones had become beneath papery skin. "That Hayes fellow treats you decent?" Sarah asked, her eyes drifting toward the window where Marcus could sometimes be seen chopping firewood in the yard. Clara nodded, then squeezed her mother's hand gently. "Good. You deserve someone who sees your true worth." Sarah's eyes closed with exhaustion. "Always knew you were something special. Child. Just didn't know how to show it the right way." By spring's arrival, Sarah Hartwell was gone. Clara buried her in the small cemetery beside the settlement church, with Marcus and Mrs. Kellner standing witness under gray Oregon skies. The headstone bore simple words carved in honest stone: Sarah Hartwell, Mother, 1840 to 1881. 2 days after the funeral, Clara packed her possessions, including her mother's wedding ring and the carved wooden box that held her father's important papers. Marcus helped her load everything into his wagon for the journey back to the boarding house, back to the life she'd chosen. But before they left, Clara walked once more to the woodshed where everything had begun. The carved initials remained clear in the weathered wood, M, H, and C-A-H, marking the place where a deaf girl had first realized someone was watching over her with genuine care. Clara traced the letters one final time with her fingertip, then turned toward the wagon where Marcus waited with patient understanding. As they drove away from the cabin, through morning sunlight, Clara felt no sadness for the life she was leaving behind. Instead, she carried gratitude for lessons learned in those final months with her mother. That forgiveness was always a choice, that love could exist alongside hurt, and that family meant far more than blood ties or legal obligations. The boarding house appeared through the pine trees ahead, smoke rising straight from its kitchen chimney in the clear spring air. Mrs. Kellner stood in the doorway waving welcome, her white apron bright in the sunshine. Thompson and the other loggers had gathered in the yard, ready to help unload Clara's belongings and welcome her home proper. Home. Not the place where she'd been born, but the place where she'd chosen to build her life among people who valued her for who she was rather than what she couldn't be. Marcus pulled the wagon to a stop beside the boarding house steps, the horses stamping and blowing after their journey. "Ready for what comes next?" he asked. Clara smiled and nodded, feeling certainty settle in her bones like warm bread on a winter morning. For the first time in her 20 years of living, she was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who'd chosen to love her, in a place where her silence was heard as clearly as any spoken words. She climbed down from the wagon and walked toward her real family, carrying nothing but hope and the absolute knowledge that she was finally, truly home. This story of Clara and Marcus speaks to something I believe our modern world desperately needs: the understanding that genuine communication goes far deeper than spoken words, and that healing happens when ordinary folks choose extraordinary kindness in their daily lives. In writing about the timber camps of 1880s Oregon, I wanted to explore how real communities form not through grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but through simple acts of inclusion and basic human respect. Clara's journey from isolation to belonging mirrors what many of us experience when we find our chosen families, those people who see our worth, even when we struggle to see it ourselves. Marcus's quiet protection and Mrs. Kellner's patient teaching remind us that heroism often looks like consistency rather than spectacle. The boarding house loggers who learned to tip their hats to Clara showed how entire communities can transform when individuals choose dignity over indifference. Perhaps most importantly, Clara's decision to care for her dying mother despite years of harsh treatment speaks to the complicated nature of love and forgiveness. Sometimes our greatest strength lies not in escaping our past, but in choosing how we respond to it with grace. These frontier stories matter because they remind us that human decency never goes out of style, and that building something lasting requires the same patience and skill as constructing anything worthwhile. Disclaimer: this work is inspired by classic Western literature and created solely for entertainment purposes. The story does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior toward any individual or group. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination, and any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental.